I'm Claudia Dean with the AAPOR Heritage Committee here in the Kaiser Family Foundation Studios in Washington, D.C., and it's April 20th, 2012. I'm extremely happy to introduce Nancy Belden, who's been kind enough to agree to be interviewed for AAPOR's Heritage Interview Series. Just to give you a sense of Nancy's background before we begin, she's a founding partner of the long-standing Washington-based polling firm Belden Rusinello, which she runs with her husband, John. In this capacity, she spent several decades doing public opinion research for a variety of progressive groups and causes on topics ranging from civil liberties to women's health to environmental issues. Nancy is a second-generation AAPOR member and served as the organization's president from 2004 to 2005. She's also served in a number of other capacities on AAPOR's executive committee and is on the board of the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research. Nancy, welcome, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to do it.
It's particularly neat to have somebody here who is a second-generation AAPOR member. You grew up in a public opinion household and said you'd be willing to talk a little bit about your dad, Joe Belden. So why don't we start there? Tell us about Joe. We didn't have a chance to interview him, so tell me about him and his business.
Okay, well, he began in the 30s in college with a poll that he did of students at the University of Texas. And from that, he became very interested in polling. He did some funny things like write to Roper and Gallup and say, basically, how do you do it? And they wrote back and said, this is sort of how you do it, a few paragraphs. So he began a poll called the Texas Poll, which became a syndicated column all across Texas when I was a child. It was modeled like on the Gallup poll, but it was just about Texas politics and public affairs. Became the model for a lot of other a lot of other state polls around the country.
How did he get that idea, though? He was a student. He was working for the newspaper, or
yeah, he was on the newspaper staff. And
because those were early days, right? The mid-30s is Gallup and Roper and Crossley, and they're just starting all those surveys.
Very early, and it was very rudimentary. It was very basic kind of stuff. They were basically making it up and learning how, figuring out what to do.
What was he studying? Was he studying?
He was a journalism major.
Yeah.
He was we always think of him as a Mexican because his family was Mexican, but he was born on actually in Texas on the border side. But he, as a young child, lived in Mexico until he came to Texas to go to high school and then to the University of Texas, and never lived in Mexico again. But he was a pioneer and a really creative kind of person who, as my mother said, thought he could do anything. So
he did that straight out of college? He started his own business?
Yeah, he and my mother basically got a commission to do a poll or two and set up. She drove it while he was actually in the war. I mean, he was not in the war, but he was stationed in Panama. She drove around Texas and distributed questionnaires, and I mean, it was really basic stuff, but and it's interesting because I feel, since I spent a lot of my childhood vacations from school as working in my father's firm, that because it was so basic and so rudimentary, and even when I was working as a child in it, what you did was so fundamentally the underpinnings of how surveys are put together, that it's really great experience and a different understanding of what we do than I think some people have today. When
you say it was so basic, what are your memories of being a child? Like, what would they be having you do? I mean, nowadays you can't imagine. I can't imagine bringing my daughter to work and what I could, here's SPSS, just can you run a crosstab for me? What were you doing?
Yeah. Well, I would code questionnaires. First of all, the questionnaires were all things done by self-administered, administered by an interviewer door to door.
Oh, live.
So we're talking about questionnaires that were sent out to people, filled out by interviewers with respondents who had been picked by some area probability mechanism. In the early days, some quotas, but probability crept in there.
Right.
But we would, as a child or a young, a teenager, what my job would be to code questionnaires, to edit them, prepare them for key punch.
What were you coding them into? By hand?
Oh yeah. You would get the questionnaire, and you knew to look to see if the skip pattern should be here, and if it wasn't skipped, to cross it out so that they didn't. And then that was editing.
Right.
Coding was reading the open ends and classifying them, and then coding them. The same people still do that.
Right.
but they don't
No
really,
computers.
yeah,
Right.
it's still different.
Right.
And then they were key punched. So I know we're sort of skipping ahead here, but what's interesting really to me about that experience, my experience growing up working in that, in the small way that I worked as a summer
Right.
employee, is that what we did in probably 6 weeks, we can now do in about 4 days.
Right.
I mean, once a questionnaire is designed and you've decided what you're doing, what was in those days packaged up and mailed in the U.S. mail to interviewers. They interviewed door to door over a week or two. They mailed their questionnaires back. A supervisor went and validated that they had done the interviews. That took time. It's just a miracle. It's so wildly different from what we do now. But those underpinnings are basically they're the basic things that you need to do for quality, for knowing that you have a good sample, are the same. And I like having that sort of perspective.
It was very
underneath it.
tangible.
Very tangible.
Compared to what we do now.
Mm-hmm.
How did your dad, I mean, in those days, it was difficult for polling to be accepted. It was such a new thing. I think it was sort of glamorous. It was, ad men and all that stuff. But how did he manage to get it popular in Texas, or get people to buy it?
Even do it. It was very new, and the newspapers that he wanted to sell his original product to were skeptical. So the first thing he did to try to develop the Texas poll was that he did a survey and sealed up the answers, the responses, the conclusions in an envelope right before an election. He went to the editor of, I believe, the Dallas Morning News, and he said, "Don't open this until after the election in a few days." So of course the guy opens it, and it had predicted basically the outcome of the survey. So with that, they bought the Texas poll.
Lucky and gutsy.
Yeah, very gutsy, very, very gutsy.
And you said there was I know you mentioned some contact with one of the Lyndon Johnson campaigns that you were telling me about.
Well, things were in that sort of pioneering, evolving period. Things and relationships were different than are today. Today, a polling firm who is doing something for the media would never talk to or give their results to a campaign. But in the early days, those lines were not so clear. So my legend has it in our family that my father took some results over to the Johnson for Congress campaign in order to help to show him in advance of their publication, just to be nice, to give him some heads up on what Paul was going to say. And Lady Bird was the receptionist. And my father was all excited to go and give this congressman his polling results and maybe brief him a little bit. And he walked in the door, and Lady Bird looked up and said, and he said, "I'm Joe Belden," and she said, "You don't look like Dr. Gallup." So with that, he felt put down, but at least he was in the category of a pollster.
Right. He sounds like he had a lot of fun with this job. I mean, he was clearly, to be a pioneer like that, you have to have a lot of self-confidence and just brio, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely, he did.
Now, did he want you to be a pollster? I mean, was this a legacy job?
Well, if it were a legacy job, I would have joined Belden Associates in Dallas.
Right.
But
which you did not do.
When I grew up, I wanted to get out of town. So I didn't live in Texas after I graduated from high school. I haven't lived there since. And sometimes I've regretted that I didn't join that firm, but he never really pushed it on us. He made it possible. I have 2 older brothers. He made it perfectly clear that we would be welcome to join him, but we'd have to march by his drummer and his rules. And we just weren't interested. So I spent the first 10 years of my adult out-of-school life working on campaigns, women's issues, reproductive rights issues, and not doing polling. But it eventually called me back.
How did that come about? How were you lured back?
Well, since I had done all this stuff as a child, I knew a lot about polling and I followed it. I read a lot about it and I read polls and so forth. So one time I had a job briefly in the California legislature working for a member, and a colleague, another young person who was working for another member, brought me some poll results, which was not uncommon that people would say, oh, Nancy is interested in polling, let's do this, right? So this guy brought me this poll and he said, look at these data here. They have 20 people in this cell and they're reporting this is something important that my member should pay attention to. And I looked at it and I said, there are 20 people in this cell. I know better than this. I could do better than these people looking at this. So I wanted a different, something different to do at that point. I was around 30, I was 30-ish. And I basically said, I think I should really revisit doing polling.
Bad polling brought you back in.
Bad polling brought me into the fore. Right.
And so then how did you manage to get a job? Did you go home? Did you?
I basically, I wanted to move back to Washington. I had gone to graduate school here. And so I began to look at the Washington firms, and I just badgered Peter Hart till he hired me. He didn't want to hire me.
Peter Hart, the
well-known
Democratic pollster.
Right. Yeah. He didn't want to hire me because I was too old for an entry-level job, but I badgered him till he took me. So I did that very briefly, and then I essentially went out on my own. I had a couple of contacts and some clients.
Again with the gutsy Belden thing. That seems,
it was
in retrospect.
Absurd. Right. It was absurd that I did it. Completely absurd that I did.
You're a young woman. You're starting your own business. Well, who were some of your early clients?
Well, I had a couple of little magazine things I did and some stuff like that. I did a little bit for some local television, not very successfully, but I did it. And then I, by happenstance, ended up on the Cranston for President campaign. Alan Cranston, the senator from California, wanted to be the Democratic nominee. And I began doing their polling, and they had very little money. So I was doing things with volunteers and pulling sample. I mean, now it comes back all those experiences from childhood. I could create a sample from some source if I had to. So we did a lot of polls for all the little primaries and caucuses that were happening, and we were successful. We learned a lot. We did a lot of good stuff there, and that's where I met John Russinello,
who's now
my husband and my business partner.
That's right.
He was the message and media guy on that campaign.
And then you dragged him into polling.
I dragged him to polling. For a while, after that campaign and after he had some other political consulting projects, I asked him to start writing reports with me because he was a great writer. And as a political consultant, he was a user of polling. So he had a really good perspective on what people wanted to read about their results. So he began writing reports, and we had a little consulting practice that originally had a lot of other communications and political media message kind of work in it. Eventually, the polling really took over, but the type of project and product that we've done ever since has the survey, focus group, all those other pieces of public opinion research and message research in it, but has a lot of a communications council kind of element on top of it, which John has really contributed to.
And you've talked a lot about your learning being on the job. I mean, you kind of threw yourself into this. I mean, were you calling your dad at 3 p.m. being like, you need to put me through because I don't know how to weight this data? I mean, how are you figuring it all out?
Yeah.
Because polling's changing a lot all through this time.
Polling is changing. Yeah, polling changed. But most of what we did, by the time I began doing it, first at Hart and then alone, had moved to telephone, right. First of all. But I would say I have basically, as you can tell from what we've said so far, I have no academic training in polling whatsoever. I had all that experience knowing the guts of it from growing up, doing all those little bits and pieces of pulling sample, of coding, of training interviewers, of validation, etc. But as far as technical stuff, I would say that a lot of it was copying, was looking to good example and copying. My father did consult a lot with me, and with both of us in the early days. And to some extent, I would say my AAPOR connections have been, and friendships and experiences of attending and being part of that has actually been a big part of my learning, because people have shared a lot. In the early days, when I really didn't know much, I would call up people. I called Kathy Frankovic. I called Shelley Goweiser. I don't know, I probably called you. I don't know who I called. And I would say, I have this question about waiting, I have the idea that I can do such and such. Is that true? Yep, that sounds like a good idea. Or no, don't go there. So it's basically by doing, but by looking at what other people are doing, by listening and learning at a conference and in other similar venues.
Now, and you've used that through your firm. You have, as you said, sort of a particular niche, which is helping causes or groups figure out their message or their audience. Can you talk a little bit about that part of the polling world? Because sometimes I feel like it's not as well exposed. Well, it's not all public, for one thing, so
right.
We don't see it. But.
Right. About, I would say, 95% of what we do is never publicly seen, because it's done for a client that wants to figure out how to either get more members or change people's minds, bring people over to their point of view, help in some way develop message and communications that's persuasive. So we use a lot of, a typical project would begin with some sort of review of existing data. So we get everything that we can find that's already been done on the subject. Some focus groups to really get people to talk about it, use the language that they use to talk about it, see what the sort of the extent in a general sense are of how much people know about something. That contributes a lot to design of a good questionnaire. And then a survey that has a big component of testing message, usually or frequently, testing ideas to see how well they fly, to identify what the target audiences are. And that stuff really remains with the client organizations.
And so your job is to be, since it's mostly private, you are being completely honest in terms of, you're not trying, you're going in to tell the client, this is what they don't like about you, this is what they do like about you, here's the good news, here's the bad news.
Absolutely. I think that one of the misconceptions over time is that you hear people say is, well, if you're a pollster with a certain political bent, you must not be very good because you must be biased. Well, clearly, I'm sure that I'm biased in my perceptions of things, but my job is to not be biased and is to learn everything I can about something and tell the client the best piece of advice that I can, or that we all can, because it doesn't serve them to not know what people really think. It's a struggle because clients don't want to. Clients want to use the research process often as persuasion itself. You have to back them off from there. So, yeah. But we've done some interesting stuff.
Yeah, tell me about a project or two.
Well, one thing that we did that was publicly, was done for public consumption was something that we did with the Washington Post a number of years ago on race, in which we put one focus group I led of white people in Baltimore or the Baltimore suburbs, and a black moderator led a group of black people on the same topics, very similar questionnaire, we each asked them independently in separate groups what they thought about whether there was racism today, how they would see it. One of the central questions was whether African Americans shared the American dream or not. And you would think that's sort of like, how can somebody blurt out something they really on that topic? But we had people in the white group say things that were surprising and that were were challenging. So the next day, or a few days later, we brought half of each group back and put them together. Mm. And we told them what we were doing. And we only invited back people that we thought had something to say. And we began the group by saying, someone in the white group said that African Americans don't seem to really share the American dream, thinking that we weren't going to identify what anybody said. But a white man immediately popped up and said, I said that, and I want to explain to you why I said that. And it was a fabulous process that really got into the issues and ended up in a very nice piece of journalism. On a completely different type of thing, one of our more behind-the-scenes kind of thing, we did a lot of work on the issue of biodiversity. Before it was really, before the word biodiversity was really being used very much. And this was for a bunch of foundations that were interested in environmental issues. They were concerned whether they were using the right term. So we went into this project with a bunch of focus groups with people. And there had been some previous, again, we did the review of data. There was some previous data that was pretty rosy about Americans thought that it was really important to save species, and this was a rah-rah good, sort of a feel-good piece of research by a very reputable firm. But we looked at it and we thought, these questions we don't feel that good about it. So we did a lot of focus groups in which people really revealed that, yes, they would say, it's great that we need to preserve biodiversity, we need to save the species, but when you said, what about rats? Or what about pigeons? This was my favorite, was the pigeons. People would say, no, I can live without the pigeons. We don't need rats. Let's get rid of rats. Let's get rid of cockroaches, right? So from that, we designed a survey that really got underneath the issues in a way that was different. And
let's preserve the cute animals.
Right. Today we only have the cute animals left.
Right.
No, unfortunately, some of the cute animals are gone too. Right. But I think that we assured the clients that the term biodiversity worked well, and it has become very commonly used and understood, and that they really had to struggle more with getting a public that was really going to support them in a deeper way, that they had a lot more education to do than they would have thought otherwise.
Again, with the tough love.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Tell me, the last topic we'll cover is just your experience with AAPOR. So you have a lifelong experience with AAPOR.
Yeah.
You came to a leadership role there. What has been sort of your pet issues? What do you see the organization as being useful for, having evolved into, or, what can you tell us about your reflections there?
Well, I think there's a constant struggle in AAPOR to continue to understand what its personality and what it is, right? Is it academic? Is it got too much government influence? Why doesn't it attract more people from the political realm and so forth? There are a lot of answers to those questions. My personal concern is that AAPOR remain really open to people, whether they're people like me who have no real academic training, who sort of learn by doing, have made mistakes. I've put some stuff out publicly that was not good because those things happen, but that I've never felt that I wasn't welcome there, that there weren't people who wanted to share stuff, that weren't interested in what we were doing, that might be of interest to people who are in a more laboratory setting. I think that continuing to make the tent be really something that, it doesn't necessarily have to be a big tent in a sense, but it needs to accept anybody and encourage other people to come into it who will gain, because we all gain from knowing each other and from learning from all those different experiences. I had someone in AAPOR come up to me a few years ago and say, what exactly is message testing? Aren't you ashamed basically that you do message testing because you're leading people? I said, you know, let's sit down, let's talk about this, and let me talk to you about why it's important to do that and how helpful it is. So, you know, but I've learned so much from other people. From the first time I sat in a meeting and heard somebody talk about the last birthday message, method of psyching somebody, and the light bulbs in the room, everyone was like, light bulbs going off, you know, to, you know, cell phones and how to handle it. It's just, it needs to have everybody in there.
And hopefully it seems to be getting bigger and bigger, so hopefully.
It gets bigger and bigger.
Right.
Yeah.
It's going the right direction. Is there anything you want to talk about that I didn't raise? Career highlights, or we're good?
I think we're good.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for coming. It was always nice to talk to you.
It's always delightful to see
Yes.
you.
Thank you again.
You're welcome.